This is the introductory education programme for supporters of FRFI. Its structure serves its purpose by establishing the need for organisation in order to meet the crisis of capitalism and fight for socialism. This programme is in no way fixed and is open to suggestions. It remains therefore a work in progress. It is being discussed in open forums across the country where FRFI supporters are active. In part 1, we looked at some of the forms which women's oppression and resistance can take under capitalism and introduced our stance as the revolutionary communist group in combating these things. In part 2, we'll take a deeper look at the material basis of women's oppression and examine how the continuation of capitalist society and the oppression of women are interlinked, and so how fighting for socialism must include fighting against gender oppression. We'll also look at existing examples of socialism post-revolution and the gains and struggles of women in those societies. So, to begin with, I'm going to include some extracts from an essay called Women's Oppression Under Capitalism, written by our comrades Olivia Adamson, Carol Brown, Judith Harrison and Judy Price, which was published in Revolutionary Communist 5 in November 1976. I'll put a link to the full essay in the description because it contains not only the citations for the quotes I'm going to be using, but it does cover a great deal, including family, employment and abortion. What the following extracts focus on, though, is the way that capitalism treats productive and reproductive labour differently. Certain reproductive labour, namely childbirth, can only and uniquely be done by the women who are capable of doing so. This, as well as other factors highlighted in the article, typically leads to women being the section of the working class most likely to be performing reproductive labour, which capitalism systemically devalues. This can spill out into the hegemonic idea that women are worth less and contributes to problems we still see today, like the gender pay gap and the disproportionate amount of women in part-time, temporary or unstable work. Women's oppression under capitalism. Part 2, the material basis of women's oppression. Section 1, domestic work and social production. Part A, introduction. As capitalism moves into crisis, women workers are bearing the heaviest burdens and the sharpest attacks. A worker's position has always been subject to the needs of capital at any particular time. The position of women as domestic workers means that they are not only primarily responsible for the maintenance and rearing of labourers themselves, but also available to augment the reserve army of labour. And as part of this reserve army, women can be drawn into production in times of boom or war, when capital will be forced to provide the minimum necessary childcare facilities, and are equally vulnerable to redundancy or the introduction of part-time work during periods of recession. Part of the confusion and one-sidedness of the debate on domestic work has been a failure to deal adequately with this interrelated aspect of women's oppression. The specific oppression of women under capitalism stems from a dual role in capitalist society. Women typically bear the main burden of domestic work, while at the same time occupying an inferior position in social production. These two aspects are mutually reinforcing. Insofar as women work in factories, offices and so on, they perform social labour. However, domestic workers carry out work in the home, which is both separate from and integral to the process of capital accumulation. Their work is necessary for capital, and yet it is outside of social production. It is privatised. To understand this essential point, we should recognise that this was not always the case. Only under capitalism do workers perform two types of labour: social labour in privately owned workplaces and privatised labour in the home. In pre-capitalist collectivist societies, before the existence of private property and class society, the matter was quite different. Household tasks in these societies were an integral part of social production. The labour of women who carried out these tasks was directly social labour. It was part of the communal labour of the society as a whole. The sexual division of labour within the family did not assign an inferior role to women. Engels made this point extremely clear. Quote, "In the old communistic household, which embraced numerous couples and their children, the administration of the household entrusted to women was just as much public, socially necessary industry as the providing of food." End quote. It was only with the increase of wealth over and above the needs of the household, leading to the growing importance of inheritance and the development of class society, that matters began to change. Products were now more and more produced for exchange. They became commodities. The administration of the household gradually lost its public character and became, as Engels described, a private service. Quote, The division of labour within the family remained unchanged, and yet it now put the former domestic relationship topsy-turvy, simply because the division of labour outside the family had changed. The very cause that had formerly made the woman supreme in the house, namely her being confined to domestic work, now assured supremacy in the house for the man. The woman's housework lost its significance compared to the man's work in obtaining a livelihood. The latter was everything, the former insignificant contribution." End quote. The development of commodity production carries in its wake the separation of domestic work from social production. With capitalist production, the labour performed by any domestic worker changes out of all recognition. Firstly, even when they are engaged in social production, their labour is no longer directly social in character, but takes on a value form, that is, indirectly social in character. Secondly, insofar as they perform domestic work in the home, their labour is not even indirectly social, it is privatised. So, the essential character of capitalism is that all workers perform indirectly social labour, and, in addition, typically women bear the main burden of privatised work in the home. Section C. Capitalist production and domestic work. Capitalism has as its sole aim and end the accumulation of capital, that is, the purchase of labour power for the purpose of expanding value. In this society, the production of use values is subordinate to the necessity to accumulate capital. The general condition for this to occur historically is that labour power, or the capacity to work, must be itself a commodity. What the worker sells to the capitalist is their capacity to labour, their labour power, which is the only commodity that has the property of creating more value than it itself possesses. This is what interests the capitalist. It is from the exploitation of the labourer that all surplus value, the source of capitalist profit, is created. By turning labour power into a commodity, capital has separated the labourer from their labour power, and the product of labour from the labourer. As a result of the separation, two sorts of consumption take place in capitalist society. Individual consumption, i.e. the consumption that takes place outside social production, and productive consumption, i.e. the consumption that takes place within social production. This distinction is important. There is firstly the productive consumption of the worker's labour power by the capitalist, who bought it for the purpose of producing products of a higher value than that of the capital which they advanced. And secondly, there is the individual consumption of the worker, in replenishing what previously the capitalist had consumed. Quote, "In the former, he acts as the motive power of capital, and belongs to the capitalist. In the latter, he belongs to himself, and performs his necessary vital functions outside the process of production." End quote. The individual consumption of the worker's means of subsistence requires the expenditure of labour time on cooking, cleaning, childcare, and so on. This is concrete labour which does not assume a value form. It falls upon the working class to carry out this labour for itself. By doing so, it preserves to the capitalist the efficacy of the commodity labour power, the means by which they alone can remain a capitalist. Quote, "The maintenance and reproduction of the working class is, and must ever be, a necessary condition to the reproduction of capital, but the capitalist may safely leave its fulfilment to the labourer's instincts of self-preservation and propagation." End quote. Domestic work, like childcare, cooking, laundering, cleaning and so on, functions in capitalist society as a whole to produce those use values which are necessary to the life of the individual. Domestic work is privatised, individual toil. It is the concrete labour which lies outside the capitalist production process and therefore cannot produce value or surplus value. Insofar as domestic work is carried out by women outside social production, it is neither productive nor unproductive labour. It is reproductive labour. Productive labour is labour exchanged with capital and engaged in the production of surplus value. Unproductive labour is labour that is not engaged in the production of surplus value, but its exchange with money, revenue. In the latter case, the domestic servant, for example, sells her service for the purpose of having it individually consumed. Domestic work, since it involves neither an exchange with capital nor revenue, is therefore neither productive nor unproductive labour. Domestic work entails the production of use values as well as the maintenance of the worker themselves. As Comrade Howell put it, domestic work, quote, "is a specific form of concrete labour, toil, which although not assuming a value form, nevertheless remains a vital and necessary condition to the reproduction of capital. The woman in this role pays in persona. Her toil is bestowed gratis on society and consequently on the capitalist, and does not enter into the price of labour power or into the creation of value in general." End quote. The separation of labour power from the labourer is inherent in the process of capitalist production. At the end of the working day, the worker must leave the production process in order to replenish what previously the capitalist had consumed, their labour power, so that this commodity can be sold again the following day. The replenishment of the capacity to labour takes place through the individual consumption of the worker. This individual consumption requires the expenditure of labour time, domestic work, as meals must be cooked, houses cleaned, children cared for, and so on. Domestic work, while a necessary condition to the reproduction of capital, remains, nevertheless, outside of social production as privatised toil in the home. There is no imminent tendency within capital to take over direct responsibility for the individual consumption of the working class after the process of production has ended. Although some capitalists may put domestic workers to work capitalistically, in commercial laundries, restaurants and so on, this merely means that while some workers are having their labour power replenished, others are having theirs consumed. After the labour power has been consumed by the capitalist, these workers are still obliged to carry out their own domestic work, since, quote, "To assume a never-ending chain of workers employed in restoring the labour power of other workers is to lose sight of the process of capitalist production as a whole." End quote. There must be a period outside of the working day, after the process of production has ended, when domestic work is performed by the working class as a whole, and since no surplus value can be produced by domestic work, capital has no interest in its socialisation. Even assuming the unlikely possibility of the full incorporation of women into social production, domestic work would still need to be performed after the working day had ended. Capital itself sets an absolute limit on the extent to which domestic work can be socialised. The necessity for the working class, and in the main the female section, to carry out domestic work thus flows from the conditions imposed by capital itself. Quote, "Only when labour power is no longer consumed by another, only when it ceases to be a commodity, will the reproduction of wealth in general become inseparable from the production of the human race." End quote. To posit the complete socialisation of domestic work, and with it the rearing of children, by capital is therefore to fail to understand the fundamental nature of capital itself. Far from being able to socialise domestic work, capital reproduces the very necessity for privatised toil in the home. What we have shown so far is that there is an absolute limit on the extent to which capital can socialise domestic work. Later sections will show it is women's role as domestic workers under capitalist production which leads to their inferior role in social production, and how this in turn reinforces their role as domestic workers. The extent to which women are incorporated in social production, the relative position they occupy, will vary considerably from country to country and with the stage of capital accumulation and the intensity of the class struggle. However, this must not be allowed to obscure the central point. Domestic work cannot be socialised under capitalism. Capitalism, as we have shown, will necessarily perpetuate the role of women as domestic workers. It is precisely because of this that women have a direct interest in the struggle for socialism. So long as the capitalist social relations remain, women have no possibility of gaining social equality in all societies across the world. Capital must be overthrown as a precondition for the establishing of a society where the responsibility for the reproduction and care of the living members of society is allocated socially and not assumed privately. This article, Women in the Revolution, is from FRFI issue 259, first published in August 2017. It was on International Working Women's Day in 1917 that women factory workers came out onto the streets of Petrograd and joined workers at the Putilov works who were protesting against government food rationing. There was a growing resentment against the Tsarist regime, and women in particular wanted to show their dissatisfaction, not only with the lack of food, but with the increasingly unpopular war that had been devastating Europe for over 2 years. The Bolsheviks had been vocal opponents of the war since its outbreak in 1914, and this fact helped strengthen their position. Women workers came out on the streets and marched to nearby factories to recruit over 50,000 workers for strike action. The government tried to stop the demonstrations, but women boldly went against the advice of their union leaders and spoke with soldiers who then refused to open fire on the demonstrations and turned their weapons instead against the Tsarist forces. The influence that women had in the February Revolution was significant. The changes brought as a result of this and the later October Revolution did more to advance women's emancipation than anything that had come before and would change the history of the world forever, Lucy Roberts reports. Conditions in Tsarist Russia were terrible for the majority of people. There was significant overcrowding in the cities and poor sanitation. Outbreaks of disease were a regular part of life in Moscow and Petrograd especially, with the life expectancy at birth being around 30 years and infant mortality exceeding twice that of many major European cities. In Imperial Russia, according to the 1897 population census, literate people made up 28.4% of the population. Literacy levels for women were a mere 13%, and this inequality was considered natural. The revolution led to dramatic improvements in literacy rates, and by 1937 the literacy rate was 86% for men and 65% for women, making a total literacy rate of 75%. In the pre-revolutionary period, women's lives were especially hard. From a young age, women often worked long hours and received much lower pay than men, as well as being expected to carry out domestic tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and weaving. Peasant women would also help in the fields when required. There was little for women outside the home, with access to government, civic, and academic institutions denied. These conditions worsened as the imperialist war raged, and this led women workers to demand change. It was impossible to live in the old way. Key female Bolsheviks realised that systemic change would be needed if women's problems were to be truly addressed. Bourgeois feminists at the time were concerned only with incremental changes, like securing women's suffrage, and many wanted to limit this right only to women who owned property. While the Bolsheviks were also concerned with universal suffrage, they recognised that this was not an end in itself and did not address the primary economic basis of women's oppression. Alexandra Kollontai, a leading socialist, had this to say in 1909. The more aware among proletarian women realised that neither political nor judicial equality can solve the women's question in all its aspects. While women are compelled to sell their labour power and bear the yoke of capitalism, while the present exploitative system of producing new values continues to exist, they cannot become free and independent persons. The ultimate objective of the proletarian woman is the destruction of the old, antagonistic, class-based world, and the construction of a new and better world in which the exploitation of man by man will have become impossible. Naturally, this ultimate objective does not exclude attempts on the part of the proletarian woman to achieve emancipation even within the framework of the existing bourgeois order. But the realisation of such demands is constantly blocked by obstacles erected by the capitalist system itself. Women can only be truly free and equal in a world of socialised labour, harmony and justice. What Kollontai and the Bolsheviks were arguing was that it is impossible to eliminate women's oppression under capitalism precisely because capitalist society depends on it. This dual oppression of women in the workplace and as domestic workers cannot be overcome under capitalism. Only socialism can provide the material conditions to make women's liberation possible. Following the October Revolution, the world's first socialist state was created, and as a result of this, women's emancipation leapt forward significantly. Women were recognised under law as being equal to men, and many other changes were brought in to further improve the lives of women. Labour laws assisted women with paid maternity leave and a minimum wage standard that was set for both men and women, health and safety protections at work, access to free healthcare, and paid holiday leave. Creches were established to allow for the socialised care of children. These did not exist in Imperial Russia and were a huge step forward, allowing women to participate in work, political, cultural, and academic life for the first time. The USSR was the first country to legalise abortion and to provide it free of charge. Separation of marriage from the church allowed couples to choose a surname. Divorce was reformed to be available at the request of either partner, and significantly, quote-unquote illegitimate children were given the same rights as legitimate children, meaning that men were legally obliged to provide support for their children whether they were married or not. For the first time, women had access to higher education, political office, the arts, culture and literature. Before 1917, university education was almost entirely confined to the nobility and professional classes. There were 91 universities, with about 112,000 students. By 1940, there were 700 universities, with 650,000 students. Women students comprised of 47% of the total. These changes meant that women had access to many areas of society that had been previously denied. In 1922, women were 22% of the workforce, but within 10 years this figure had grown to 32%. Socialism in Russia was a progressive force for women's emancipation, and many of these advances were groundbreaking. However, it is important to note that women's oppression was not eliminated in the USSR. Even after all the legal and economic changes in society which freed women from many aspects of the oppression they previously experienced, old ideas still persisted in people's minds and attitude. Assata Shakur, a former US Black Panther, commented on this after years of refuge in socialist Cuba.
I mean, it's a struggle, and I think that women have to struggle really hard within the revolution to change the day-to-day practice, because the family code is real, it exists. Cuban women, for me, are the strongest, most capable human beings probably on the face of the earth. I mean, they work, they do guard duty, they are activists in the CDR, they're activists in the Federation. The macho culture that the revolution inherited is very deeply embedded, and women who were activists in the Federation at the beginning had to go and literally beg people to let women work in the street. You know, that, I mean, they couldn't talk about equality. They had to talk first about men helping women, because that was the objective reality where they were. And so that it was a process that they had to go from one step to step 2 to step 3. And that, you know, people from the U.S. and developed capitalist countries think, well, you know, that their situation can be just transferred to other countries just mechanically, and that other people can be at the same level of consciousness. And I think that we have to become much more sensitive to the objective conditions that other people are dealing with.
That was from an interview with Assata in Havana in 1992, and in 1996, FRFI got to interview Assata. She said, "It was clear that a revolution was not a magic wand that you wave and all of a sudden everything is transformed. The first lesson I learned was that a revolution is a process. So I was not that shocked to find sexism had not totally disappeared in Cuba, nor had racism, but that although they had not totally disappeared, the revolution was totally committed to struggling against racism and sexism in all their forms. That was, and continues to be, very important to me. It would be pure fantasy to think that all the ills, such as racism, classism or sexism, could be dealt with within 30 years. But what is realistic is that it is much easier and much more possible to struggle against those ills in a country which is dedicated to social justice and to eliminating injustice." The newly formed USSR committed itself to dealing with women's oppression and took huge steps towards achieving this despite the years of hardship and imperialist-backed civil war that followed October 1917. The new government established the Zhenodiel, the women's department of the Secretariat of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party. This body promoted mass women's organisation to tackle illiteracy and to provide education about new laws and policies throughout the Soviet Union. Representatives of the Zhenodiel would travel thousands of miles across the country in order to campaign for the revolution, setting up 125,000 literacy schools. The Zhenodiel published a monthly magazine, Kommunistika, which dealt specifically with issues such as sexuality, abortion and women's liberation, and linked these issues with the struggle for socialism. The Bolsheviks realised that the revolution depends on building revolutionary consciousness, and this process continues even when a socialist society is established. Today we can look to the Cuban Revolution for examples of how a modern socialist country has made progress towards equality. Cuba is ranked third in the world in terms of most female representation in the country's main government body, with a Congress that is 49% female. Women currently comprise 36% of university enrolment, more than 60% of the technical and professional sector, and more than 70% of lawyers in the country. They also constitute a majority in key sectors, such as health and education. In scientific research, they are a significant force, but in 1953, barely 12% of the female population was in paid work. In the USSR, after the revolution, as in Cuba, huge steps were made towards achieving equality, which would simply have been impossible without addressing the material basis of oppression. Capitalism cannot provide emancipation for women. Only by addressing the material and economic roots of women's oppression can we begin to build a more equal society. Only under socialism can true women's liberation be achieved. For more FRFI articles or to find out about getting involved, please go to our website revolutionarycommunist.org or frfi.co.uk.